So welcome back to For Weddings and a Funeral or Two. Today, being the second class, is in fact the day that we are going to talk a lot about death. My family thinks this is hysterically funny since it's my second day back after 5 days out. So I have been sicker than the Dickens, and you will hear me hacking up a little bit, I'm afraid, during class today. So thematically appropriate, we give you death. So we're going to talk today a little bit about iconography, but not very much. We did a lot of iconography last time. Today is my day to bring in a lot of music. We're going to talk about sort of liturgical practice and memorials of a variety of sorts. And I gave you that preview last time that we're going to end talking today about deploration, laments on the death of composers. So when we get there, you know it's almost time to leave. So today, going to talk a bit about the late Middle Ages. So I'm going to do the same thing we did last time, ask you to find a good buddy and do just a couple of minutes brainstorming. What do we mean by the late Middle Ages? What are the events that are our framework for the events that are happening musically and otherwise? So if you can kind of come up with 13th to 15th century, what do you think of? What can you remember? Sort of 5 key events. We'll give you a couple minutes to reconstruct that part of your history from way back when. We'll do a little bit of class brainstorming, and then I'll give you some sort of timeline events that I think shape our liturgical practice. So a couple minutes of brainstorming, find a neighbor, go. So Protestant Reformation is right at the start of the 16th century and is often a good frame for when we end the late Middle Ages with the Reformation as we move into the 16th century. And in fact, we're going to kind of come up to that moment and then ignore Luther altogether. So that's your preview of today's outline. Galileo. Galileo is actually 16th century, so that'll be appropriate in a couple of classes. So, yeah. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Columbus sailed the deep green sea in 1493. So there we have the exploration. Crusades. So I like the late Middle Ages because it's sort of the Disney Middle Ages. You got people like Bad King John, right around 1215, the Magna Carta, Richard the Lionhearted, the capture of Richard the Lionhearted, Bad King John, his brother, not choosing to pay ransom because he was who? Bad King John. So you have right at the start of that, we have the Robin Hood era. We have Crusades because Richard was out of town from England on crusade, gets stuck coming back. It's also, I like this period because it's also our Monty Python and the Holy Grail version of the Middle Ages. So if you think about castles and sieges and a little bit of peasant revolting, the peasants were revolting, yeah. Okay, y'all need to go out and review your Monty Python. And so we have that going on. What are some other events? Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine. That's actually what leads to King Richard and King John, and nobody remembers poor Geoffrey. And so if you haven't rewatched The Lion in Winter in a while, I recommend that to you highly. Great movie, one of my favorites. So yep, that leads us into this late Middle Ages. And why? Because Eleanor of Aquitaine was deeply cultured. Her grandfather was a troubadour himself, that is, an inventor of poetry. She grew up at a court where being educated was the going thing. She herself was deeply educated and the richest woman in Europe. She married the French king. She found that a bore, although she did get to go off on crusade herself with her fellow handmaidens. They dressed for a while as Amazons. That appears to be a true story. Rode bare-breasted across the countryside, which I think would be uncomfortable. Had their sort of fantasy of the Crusades, came back, discovered that Paris was boring, divorced the French king, married Henry, so wife of 2 kings, mother of 2 others. And then there's poor Geoffrey, who was destined for the church because you didn't have a lot of land for people to inherit. So that's our sort of framing narrative. We bring in education to court. We use these stories of romantic chivalry as a framing device, and that's one of the things that I think is a feature of this late Middle Ages. It wasn't so much that they were chivalrous, they were actually pretty nasty cruds. But they believed that chivalry was important, so that's one of your sort of thematic takeaways. Other events. Black Death. So yeah, I feel it right now. In the middle of the 14th century, those stupid rats get on the ships and they come up through the trading routes. They make it to Europe where nobody has any immunity. And estimates are that between a third and half of Europe dies. It is an amazing plague and a terrible time for Europe. It didn't come de novo. There are waves of plague before this, but the bubonic plague is special. It has both your fleas as vectors, and it has a pneumonia form, where just by breathing you can pick it up from some individuals. And so really, really deadly, really, really catastrophic, and coming after a period of famine across Europe. I mentioned last time the arrival of the Little Ice Age. So let's back up a little bit. Right at the start of the 14th century, with the arrival of the Little Ice Age, you also have the year of the Great Rains in 1315. Almost no crops were able to be harvested. Massive starvation. And so you have not only are your crops not coming in well, you lose your seed corn for next year. That leads to waves of successive famine over time. You additionally have what I have been told by my economist friends, the great herring die-off. With the arrival of the Little Ice Age, the temperature of the seas changes, and the fishing fleets that are going out to their normal locations to harvest the fish that sees everybody through the winter, they're coming back without a full catch. That's catastrophic because if you think about Easter, which is your spring feast, the moment at which you are sort of making a celebration both for, if you're Christian, for the sort of Christian narrative, but also you're celebrating the fact you've made it through another winter. It's the first of the really big spring feasts. Lots of reason you have fish. It's one of the things that's kept you through the winter. It's one of the provisions. You dry a lot of fish. That is what you have in the larder as you're coming into this last period before you start getting actual green things out of the ground. With no fish, you've got no ability to last all the way through the winter. So when the Black Death comes, you've got a population weakened by starvation that has been living in a period that's much colder than before. Access to firewood is limited because the kings have made rules about where you can collect firewood, and it's mostly not in the king's forest. What forest does the king own? Whatever the king wants. And so the ability to heat your home, you're doing a lot of your heating by burning manure. Oh, that's a healthy environment. So it's a period that the Black Death comes along, and we think that it's sort of a double whammy. Both is it more virulent than before, but it's hitting a population that's more vulnerable than before. So that's one of the defining events of Western civilization. It was a terrible time, and then we talk as if the Black Death were a one-time event. The plague comes back on a cycle of every 4 to 7 years. There are some lovely lists of plague dates in Vienna, and you can sort of see, and then it's 2 years, and then it's 4 years, and then you have a period where they think it's all gone because it goes 7 years, but it keeps coming back. It remains endemic, and it isn't until that period in the 17th century when the virulence seems to have dropped off that you can start worrying about other diseases as being more problematic than the plague itself. So yeah, Black Death, a biggie. Not entirely negative from a cultural point of view. We'll talk a little bit about why, but that is certainly a defining moment. So we've got bad King John and the Crusades, the rise of the Habsburgs. The Babenberg dukes in Vienna die out. There's a period in which nobody knows who's going to be the next duke. 4 different families try for it. The Habsburgs wind up successful. So everything you know about Vienna and the Habsburgs is because in the 13th century, somebody got lucky in the who can rule next lottery. Marco Polo comes back. We get the trade routes and the sort of definition of the spice route that is very much important to the 14th and 15th centuries. We are going to start thinking about how to treat illness with things like pepper and spices and good smells, because if you're sick, there's nothing like a good smell to combat it, so it brings you back into balance. It is also a period that the Crusades do not go well. They do not go well on a variety of fronts. One is it's really hard to get people to go on crusade, and that's going to be a narrative throughout the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. In fact, in the 15th century, one of the famous ceremonies was the banquet of the oath of the pheasant. Not peasant with a P, pheasant with a PH, the bird. They actually had a bird on a collar. Golden collar, of course. They brought the bird in to the banquet. The banquet went on for, I can't remember the number of courses, at least 9, because there are 9 different musical intermezzi. Everybody is there. The Burgundian dukes have invited all the nobility of Europe to witness this big event. They're sitting around, they're eating, they're talking, and then they're going to all swear to go on crusade. And they all come up one by one, and they put their hand on the bird, and they put their hand up, and they swear that as soon as so-and-so goes on crusade, they will follow. So when so-and-so never goes on crusade, nobody's obligated to do anything because you don't want to be forsworn. So careful wording and avoidance is a way to get out of going on crusade. It's also difficult to go on crusade because you have to go all the way down to the Holy Land, and that's a whole lot of travel. It's easier to go to the south of France, declare them heretics, and take over a bunch of property. So the Albigensian crusade to stamp out heresy in southern France is one of the sort of substitute crusades that the church takes on. That event in the 13th century, remember we talked about Eleanor of Aquitaine and the troubadours and the poetry and court culture. The south of France was where troubadours were sort of endemic. It was what you did. You had a court, you had a troubadour. You might have 3. They're all writing poetry. It's very cool. You have competitions. You're very cool. And that publicity around what your court is like with all of these poets and musicians and culture, that was so important when you stamp out the Albigensians and therefore wipe out a bunch of those southern French noble households. The troubadours pack up. They go to the northern part of France and become trouvères. Some of them go off to Germany where they become Minnesinger. And so you have this kind of moving around of a poetic musical culture in which the local vernacular is a cool thing. And that happens throughout the 14th century. Couple more things, the papal schism, the popes move out to Avignon. That goes well for about 50 years, and then there are riots, and so they decide that they're going to elect a Roman pope instead of an Avignon pope up in France. That doesn't take. They elect a second pope. You can't have 2 popes. So Europe splits in allegiance, and then you have to decide if you're going to ask the pope for something, which pope do you think is the right pope to follow? And this period of having rival popes goes on until they have an election. Let's depose both popes and elect a new one. Yeah, that doesn't work, so then you have 3 popes. And so that carries all the way into the 15th century when you finally have a church council in which the good popes decide that they're going to step down and allow Martin V to emerge as the one Catholic pope. So 14th century, Avignon, the papal schism, 15th century, a return to sort of the normal Catholic environment of one pope. We like Martin V because he likes libraries. So the foundation of the Vatican Library is from Martin V. So a lot of different events going on. We're going to talk a little bit about how these kind of thread in to our musical and liturgical culture over time. Great. So, lots and lots of death. The Black Death, Crusades, wars, the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses, all of these are going on in this period. It's hard to find a year in which there isn't a war somewhere in Western Europe. When there are pauses in the war, for example, the 100 Years' War, there are a couple of intermittent periods of so-called peace in which the nobles aren't fighting. But because you're using mercenaries to manage your war, when the mercenaries aren't on hire, the mercenaries aren't being paid. What do unpaid mercenaries do? They go ravaging through the countryside. So there are some accounts that suggest that it might be better to have the actual formal war than to have this period of so-called peace in which your livelihood is very much at threat because the troops can come through right as you were getting ready to harvest that grain and take it from you, leaving nothing for the following season. So as we're thinking about death, we have three useful cultural cliches that I found most everybody brings in their understanding of the Middle Ages. It's that sort of common cultural legacy. When we say Middle Ages, you're going to remember a few things. One of them is the idea of the Last Judgment, Judgment Day. And so Giotto's Last Judgment from the Scrovegni Chapel, if you've never watched it, when I put the PowerPoint up, you could go click on that. There's a lovely sort of lesson on the painting fresco on Khan Academy. I recommend it to you highly. I'm just going to mention one of the aspects, that helps if you actually point, one of the aspects that happens on Judgment Day is the judgment of those who have been good in their release from purgatory and those who have been evil, who are then going to be consigned to hell. And so one of the things we know about Judgment Day is that it is going to come in the future, and that there is therefore a period of waiting in which more or less good souls are waiting to be adjudicated. And so there's a kind of cultural buildup of processes of intervention, of prayer, that will release a soul from purgatory and let them go on up to heaven, which is their presumed final destination. And there is a lot of investment in liturgy that is doing that work of prayerful intercession. Prayers to the Blessed Virgin, prayers in memory of the dead, services that are designed to help release those souls, and whole monastic communities that are devoted to these acts of prayer to intercede on individuals' behalf. Individuals can also establish anniversary foundations. They can come in and say, I'll give you the proceeds from half my vineyard at such and so, and on an annual basis. And in perpetuity, the monks or the nuns or the priests or whoever you're, the chaplains, will then say this or that kind of service on my behalf, on the behalf of my family, my children, my parents, my uncle, my whatever. And some of those gifts are quite generous. The proceeds of half a vineyard is a nice financial addition to the church, and in exchange for that, they will do these ceremonies. Most of these endowment records also have out clauses. If for some reason the nuns aren't able to say the service, then they will give X amount of wax to the leper hospital. So every year you're going to have this service said. If the nuns are too sick or there's something else going on and they're not able to do it, then you will have part of your gift that gets tasked off to some other good cause, and the lepers will then presumably pray on your behalf, because it's very nice to have wax for candles, because that's how you see during the night. So this process of foundation and the process of establishing ceremonies of memorial become a standard part of 13th, 14th, and 15th century, particularly monastic culture is what I work on. So I've read literally hundreds of these. I'm going to take a momentary aside and tell you about one of them by my favorite crazy lady from Vienna. I'm like, the woman was nuts. So most foundation records, they run about this long. You know, I want this service said on behalf of me and my X, Y, and Z family members. And if they don't do it, then I want that to happen. Now, she's really obsessed about this, like control freak of the 15th century. So these nuns are to say this service, not that service, not the other service, but the one that is found in her book. Her book that has these kinds of decorations on the cover of the book that she has given to the convent. And when these nuns are going to say this service that is in her book, then they should say the full service, not some portion of the service, but the entire thing as found in her book, which has the gilt covers. And once they have said this service, they are to then stand in community and they are to pray for me. They are to pray for me and my family. They are to pray for me, my family, and my extended family. And if they do not pray for me, or do not pray for me and my family, or do not pray for me, my family, and my extended family, then they are in violation of this agreement in which they were to do this service out of the book, which I have given to the monastery. The thing runs on, I kid you not, when I cut and pasted the whole document, it's like this long, and she keeps iterating those things that are important. It is a very specific written service that she has been using. She's not a nun, she's just a member of the civil community. So what does that tell us? You've got a woman who has a chant book or has a prayer book that has a service that's been so meaningful to her that she wants these nuns to say it for her. She wants them to say it out of her book in the form that she knows. She wants them to do it because it matters to the salvation of these people who are important to her, and especially to her herself. So it's not unusual for women to endow these services. I get that question because we tend to think of men being the financial rulers of the household, but men and women endow services about equally. What is unusual here is that she goes on sort of at such length, and she does make provisions for that wax that I mentioned, that the wax will go to the leper hospital if the nuns don't do their duties. But she also points out that if the male clerics fail to support the nuns, that the local bishop should go in and interfere with the men because they are obligated by this foundation to support the nuns in doing this kind of prayer. So a whole bunch of interesting detail packed up in one individual's hope for prayer to provide her with salvation. So Judgment Day, it's an operational cultural force in this period that leads to the establishment of an awful lot of liturgical endowments. My second big thing for the day, the Requiem Mass. For this, I blame Mozart. Everybody knows that the big thing that you do with dead people is sing the Requiem Mass. And the Requiem Mass, because we know Mozart, we know is going to be like massive, and there are going to be choirs, and there's going to be an orchestra. Well, not in the Middle Ages, we don't have orchestras. And yes, we do have choirs, but they're mostly not singing polyphony. They're singing plain chant. So over here, yep, thank you. Requiem aeternam. So we start with a sort of invocation, and that word, requiem, is the first word you hear in this introit from the Requiem Mass. So a Requiem Mass has a number of sections to it, like any Mass. There's an introductory chant that's sort of the processional, getting everybody in, quieted down, focused on the liturgy. You have your ordinary, those parts of the chant, parts of the liturgy that are invariable, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, and you have those specific wordy propers that are the words that you say for this specific event. Well, the Requiem Mass is documented, a Eucharistic ceremony in memory of someone dead is found in the late 2nd century. Most of the chants for the Requiem Masses come from 10th, 11th century chant books. Why not the 8th or 9th century? Don't know. It's not part of the cycle, so it's not part of the temporale or the sanctorale, the ceremonies that are in celebration of Christ's life, which include Sundays, or those ceremonies for specific feasts. It's like one of those ad hoc things that you do as needed, so it doesn't quite fit into chant books of the 8th and 9th century, which tend to be organized either for the parts for Christ or the parts for saint. So 10th century, start getting more books coming down. We start getting Requiem copies. The chants themselves were votive masses. What that means is our cultural trope is Gregorian chant inspired by the Holy Spirit, who sung the melodies into Pope Gregory's ears. He wrote them down. It was inspired chant. We're all going to do the same chant. Yeah, not so much. Regional variations were normative, and the Requiem is a place where there's a lot of variability. So where I might be living in Bessignon, and I might do a ceremony that includes text A, you who live 15 miles down the road might be doing a text B for that same liturgical moment. So it's not a one-size-fits-all form, the way some of the other chants of the period really do become everyone everywhere across Europe is going to do the same thing. That variability meant that you could sort of adapt the texts to be appropriate, and we do have a fair bit of interesting work going on now to look at what that variability might tell us about sort of regional thoughts about the memorializing of the dead. But most of that work is presently underway rather than stuff I can read and cite to you. So it's one of those, stay tuned, because scholars have realized that there's a body of information we haven't fully tapped into. So let me toggle over to a sound recording or two. Down. And this is one of the texts on your handout. The introit and its translation are given, and I'm going to play just the first part of this. You can go back later if you want to watch the whole thing. This is the Deller consort recording, which I like very much. Multiple notes for each syllable. It's pneumatic. First, it's followed by this psalm. Notice the repeated note. Notice it comes back up to that repeated note. Notice it comes back up again to the repeated note. Stays on the repeated note. And then we're back to the beginning. All right, so it's framed. You have an antiphon, you have a reciting note that's going to be how you say the psalm, and you're going to come back to that reciting note a lot until you get through the text. And reciting notes are really useful, but they eventually end. And then you go back into an elaborate something or other. In this case, being the introit, you come back to the opening antiphon and you repeat it in toto. That is how you get that Requiem Mass started. The introit gathers all of the people who are celebrating the ceremonial, and then you move into the Kyrie. One of the pieces of the Requiem Mass, but the one that gives the Requiem Mass its name, we're going to come back to that, in about 20 minutes. So hold that thought. Requiems, masses, that's a thing. Judgment Day, masses, and then the third trope that we have, the thing that everybody knows, is the Dies Irae. Dies irae, dies illa, da 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 da. Da, 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 da. It's a little bit more melodic. That's because the chant was invented later. It's a sequence. Sequences, so chants that have a lot of reciting tones tend, in general, to be more 7th, 8th, 9th century. Chants that are more melodic tend to be 10th, 11th, 12th century. So the Dies Irae is a later addition to the chant repertoire, and it is one, that sort of idea of Day of Wrath. That's something that has been picked up and serves as, if you're going to have a movie and you want to reference those evil Middle Ages in which lots of people die, out comes the Dies Irae. And of course, even people like Berlioz knew that as the point of reference that we brought. So the Dies Irae is part of the Symphonie Fantastique, a point of reference out of the chant repertoire that signals all of these thoughts about death and dying. Well, I'm going to use a little excerpt out of the Bergman movie, Seventh Seal. And I use this because I'm not actually going to play the bit before it, but if you've seen the movie, you'll remember that the peasants are out in the village and they're doing the happy thing. They're entertaining the local population. The traveling folks have come. They've got costumes. They've got little instruments. They're singing. They're dancing. They're having a good time. And in come the flagellants, those individuals who are so terrified by the events that are going on that they feel obliged to take up in a personal way the kind of punishment that Christ suffered on the cross. And so flagellant ceremonies start in the 13th century, so before the Black Death. The flagellants were, it's a movement that sort of sweeps across Europe. It's very emotionally moving to attach yourself to a form of self-harm in the aid of accomplishing something deeply meaningful for society. And they saw this as a sort of a redemptive act. Some people did prayer. These people are reenacting Christ's suffering in order, again, to intercede for the souls of the whole community. So it's not limited to flagellants. There are whole conversations, particularly in Dominican literature, about monastic practices, ascetic practices, self-starvation, hair shirts where you wear the hair on the inside in order to bring up a rash that's deeply painful, the beating of oneself with the whips with little iron bits attached to the end to be sure that you can bring up blood, self-prostration in a church on the floor throughout the night for hours, those kinds of acts that we see as deliberately harmful, but which are framed in a mystic way as being a form of intercession, just like Christ's intercession for the population. And so there's a long set of narratives. I'm going to play the little bit of the Bergman because I think it captures some of the flavor and some of the assumptions that we ourselves bring to the Dies Irae. So these are our two little stage performers. They've just been interrupted by the noise in the distance. little disturbing. And we have such a sort of stock in that image of the dies irae that we tend to think of that as the way that medieval communities are really thinking about death. This focus on wrath, on death, on rage, on fire. But a lot of the work that is going on in this society, even though it takes up Christ's suffering as a thematic narrative, is really thinking about redemption. So I want to give you, for the rest of today, a bit of a conversation around redemptive practices and what this kind of prayerful singing is really meant to be doing in people's lives. In my next life, I will have a better toggle. All right. So we've talked about Judgment Day, the Requiem Mass, and the Dies Irae, because you needed it in your heads. I have a couple of, if you want a better, sweeter recording, a nice one, I recommend the one that's performed in alternatum, which is on the slide deck. So we've got these cultural cliches for how we understand death, but let's talk a little bit about the Black Death, because yes, it is a thing, and yes, during the 14th century, there are in fact plague masses where the community will gather together and they will go in procession carrying crosses or carrying saints' relics, and they will go through town and they will gather at people. But these ceremonies are more meant as an invitation to the community to come together in prayer, to figure out where sin lies in the society, and to do away with sin so that we can return to a more stable, happier past. So it is a bit of a narrative of nostalgia that's going on. The Black Death is not well illustrated. It is not something that appears in a lot of manuscripts. I have had folks say, well, that's because everybody's dying and they're not making manuscripts where they're dying. No, actually, one of the interesting things about manuscript production is that at the start of the century, you start with sort of a fairly robust manuscript production community going on, producing, yay. Over the course of the century, the slope goes like this, more and more books being copied. And that ramp of how many manuscripts are copied extends through the 15th century. And Gutenberg, remember Gutenberg, another one of our 15th century events, he invents printing in order to help meet the demand for manuscripts. So one of the things about the late Middle Ages is it's a period of literacy. So there are a lot of manuscripts copied. There are even manuscripts copied in the 1348, 1350 period, and a few of them give us graphic depictions of what the illness was like. Those buboes, those sores that are where the disease is made manifest in the body, and then the kinds of rash that people could bring to the ceremony. But you will note, here are a whole bunch of sick people, and they are all coming, but they are being blessed. So we talked last time about the role of the celebrant. One of the things that the Black Death seems to have driven is a return to more church-based practices in terms of liturgical production. The importance of somebody providing you with that blessing becomes enshrined in this moment of great social tension. And so the larger churches wind up with these gifts that are being given to support these practices of elaborate church ceremonial. At first, a lot of the gifts are for things like the incense. And again, Bergman liked the incense, but incense was seen as a blessing. I said before, the spice trade, right? Good smells drive out bad evil. And so sensing the population is a way to try and, again, fumigate the evil out of them. Doesn't work particularly well, and we do have an awful lot of records of particularly parish priests who die during this period because they are among the few people who are still tending to the sick. Even the doctors run away and hide. Your priests and your monastics are most likely to stick with it. because they believe in their heart that that's the good that they are called to do. And then the Black Death, that seems to have put the theme of death into people's heads. And so late 14th, 15th, and into the 16th century, those depictions of the dance of death become a kind of a cultural topos. You can find them in some of the frescoes in the buildings that are where celebrations were outside of graveyards. You can find them on wooden art images. You have a lot of woodcuts. They seem to have sold pretty well. And so this idea that the skeletal death is going to come and take people off becomes a narrative that people are willing to invest in. So, where does that lead us? I'm going to talk about the other ceremony for death, the one that was actually used normatively. So I've said we have our three things, Judgment Day and the Requiem and the Dies Irae, but what people are praying on a daily basis is the office of the dead. The office of the dead is performed daily. We know it mostly, well, I know it mostly from my monastic communities. It's just a daily obligation. Every day you do the lessons and you'll do the chants and you'll have the readings. You'll do your little responsory and then you'll go about your business because you have done good through this form of prayer. But what happens in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century is the laity also pick up this practice of reading the office of the dead. They may not do it in song, but the song of the office of the dead is not terribly elaborate. We'll see that here in just a minute. If you think about books of hours, those most elaborate of the beautiful manuscripts that come down from Western Europe, they will have a whole variety of prayers, a lot of things devoted to the Blessed Virgin, who is the intercessory for humankind. And then they'll have the office of the dead. And you can usually identify that because it actually will show up in pictures, and I'll show you one in just a minute. So your readings for the office of the dead come from the book of Job. Job was long-suffering, so that makes a good moment if you're going to think about life and death. Job had it in spades. Things did not go well for Job. Spare me, O Lord, for my days are nothing, is one of the readings. Tell me why thou judgest me so. Doth it seem good to thee that thou shouldst calumniate me and oppress me, the work of thine own hands? So these readings out of Job are sort of a contemplative. What does it mean to be human in an environment where we suffer so? And yet we have this promise of redemption. And so the office of the dead is constructed around excuse me, constructed around these readings, but before the readings and after them, you have these short little bits of chant, in plain chant, that can be done in community. So I will show you one, and then I will play you one. So here I said you can find these in your books of hours, because they're usually decorated very elaborately. You often have people, they're wearing black, but that's just a serious color. And in this case, you have the actual death scene. Often you'll just have a group of clerics gathered around a kind of a book stand reading at a distance, or you'll have people in prayer with their hands folded up. So again, those signals of seriousness. But what are they actually doing? If you flip your handout over, the back side, number 2, actually gives you then an antiphon and a psalm. So we saw an antiphon and a psalm for the Requiem Mass, and that was kind of elaborate. Like you can imagine that the church choir actually might have practiced that thing before they went out and did it. Because when we did the Requiem Mass, that's one of 4,000 chants for the church year, so kind of elaborate. You might want a little review before you go and do it. As you will see from the office, this is something you're doing daily, and part of the job is to be able to fit it into the time allotted. So musically, it's going to do that for us. Sorry. So we're in the antiphon. it's got a little bit of a ductus to it, a little bit of a shape, because it's an antiphon. It's supposed to be not terrifically elaborate. So your antiphon is the elaborate. Now we're going to do the psalm. Just like before, there's a reciting tone, but now our formula is even more simple. So you have this reciting tone here, and you have a comma gesture, and then you have this again, and then you have that little cadence formula, and you use that over and over and over and over again until you're done with the psalm. Okay? So the ability to get through the psalm in a relatively straightforward manner is there. You are saying the psalm every day. You are going to be able to walk in and you're going to be able to go, this is my reciting pitch, and I know that I'm going to go until I get to my cadence, and then I'm going to go along until I get to my longer cadence. So they have a formula, kind of an elaborate antiphon, psalm, and then there's some responding to and fro, where the celebrant, or the prioress, or the contrix, or the sucentor, or somebody who's in charge in the community sings a little bit, and the choir responds. And they sing, and the choir responds. And they sing, and the choir responds. And then you move on to your next reading. So it's a little formula where you can run through some spiritually meditative music, a bit of contemplative reading out of the Bible, a bit of thinking about what that means to us in community. Therefore, we're praying for you forever and ever. Amen. And then move into the next portion of it. So if you're doing the office for the dead, it's not nearly as elaborate as the Mass, but everybody's doing it. Village merchants are ordering books of hours that have the placebo, the start of the office of the dead, decorated, and then all of the chants for that copied out, so that it can mirror this practice that has been going on in monastic community, but they can bring it back into the home. Women start getting trained in enough literacy to teach their household how to do this form of prayer. That's kind of cool, because we know this is a period in which literacy is like a 10 to 20% of the population piece. We're starting now to expand our literate practices in order for people to be praying in this intercessory way. That production of these deluxe manuscripts, remember I said, our manuscript production goes like this, and the Black Death doesn't really change that curve at all. It's this practice of prayerful worship that is kind of being made manifest, and an ability to be doing it yourself without the need for the celebrant. Because you can pray from your little book of hours in your home. So when you go to church, you're looking for the more elaborate ceremonies, right? So there's a kind of a cultural response as people start doing this very simple prayer where I can say it myself and I can respond in the home. Then when you go to church, you're looking for something more elaborate, and we get that in spades. And so we have the books of hours. Special occasions then wind up being occasions that are more elaborately constructed. I'm just going to touch briefly on the Requiem Masses. And here you have an example of the Dance of Death. Even kings and prelates are subject to the calling of death. Yes?
That was a national maestro, spoken Finnish last year, and he said that there was a European
So the question is, does the idea that music will have a role in saving the world connect to this era? I don't actually know the quote, so I don't know what was being referenced, but I think it very clearly applies to the kind of cultural context in which this music is being created. And we see that, again, back to my endowment records, we see that in the way that people are paying for services, that they believe that this musical ceremony is going to be an important part of the sort of intercessory structure. What changes in the 15th century is the arrival of polyphony for our more elaborate ceremonies. I'm going to play just a little bit of Akagam because I want you to go out and listen to it on your own. And I have here a nice little procession, this idea that we are going to be sort of processing as a community and then coming in together for a more elaborate ceremonial surrounding death, is one that picks up again in the courtly milieu. So Akagams is the earliest surviving polyphonic requiem. Multi-voices at the same time, elaborate polyphony, beautifully constructed, uses the plain chant as its musical inspiration, and he sort of paraphrases it in each of the sections of his Mass. The Mass is a little bit problematic. We don't know why it was created, but we think it was for one of the two kings that Akagam served. So there's been some speculation that Charles VII, who died in 1461, or possibly Louis XI, that the event surrounding their death would have called for these musicians and community. Since the French kings had about 25 professional musicians on their staff, they certainly had the resources to do an elaborate ceremonial like this. Let me pop over and play you a little bit of it. Sorry, can't see. Down, go away, go away. There we go, Requiem. So this is, again, if you want to flip back over to item number 1, this is that same Requiem, the introit, but now done up with multiple voices. But still elaborate. Words just a little bit faster than before. So get an antiphon, psalm, and antiphon. Is that not glorious? And you think about the kind of ceremony that people walked into church expecting. Plain chant. And then all of a sudden, out walk these professional singers to do not all of the Mass, but special movements within the Mass, in this glorious polyphony, transcendent polyphony, spoke to people, must have spoken to people, because as you can see from the PowerPoint, this was the start of the new thing. In this generation, we're not sure who wrote one first, Dufay or Ockeghem. Both of them we know wrote requiems. Dufay's was three-voice. Dufay's is lost. It's one of the great lamented absences in our music historical past. And because we don't know whether Ockeghem's was written for Charles or for Louis, we don't know whether Dufay's came first and then Ockeghem's or vice versa. But they're both individuals who work for the French kings. So really, it's about asserting an identity of kingliness and ceremonial around court. Now, in this period, why would that matter? Well, think back. We had that whole 100 Years' War thing where England claimed it owned France, which is a bit of a problem from the French perspective. And then we had poor Joan of Arc, who was successful for 2 years and then burned at the stake. But then this idea of the French monarchy as sort of ascendant becomes part of a narrative of nation formation in the latter part of the 15th century. Back to our idea of Eleanor of Aquitaine, if you want to be an ascendant court in Europe, what are you going to do? You're going to have musicians and poets and artists, and you're going to show that you can do that cultural thing better than anybody else. Well, it seems to have worked. Now, I do like the little anecdote about Dufay, and I know it's just an aside, and I'm going to cheat and put it in anyway. Dufay did write a requiem, and we do know that he paid to have services done for him with one of his motets, not his requiem. So that's an interesting moment. It suggests to me, although it's not the dominant musicological interpretation, but at least my version is, requiems are for important people, motets are for the everyday person. Dufay saw himself as a really splendid performer, but nevertheless an everyday person. Ockeghem, his survives, so we can listen to it, and it's lovely. What happens is that the next generation, anyone who was anyone as a composer, appears to have written Requiem Mass in a polyphonic form. And so you see there, it's like the who's who of the, particularly the French orbit courts. You have Pierre Delarue, you have Antoine Brumel, Antoine de Febvre, Claudin de Sermezy, who famously wrote Tant que vivre nage florissant, really pop composer of the early 16th century. He wrote a serious requiem. So the ability to write both in these happy secular styles and in these serious ceremonial styles was important. You have Johannes Prioris, Jan Richefort, and so on and so forth. It's like a who's who working in France in the 15th or in early 16th century. And everyone is writing one of these polyphonic requiems. So the moment has broken free, and we're now looking for really fancy ceremony. That is something that is so different from the 13th century when we're just doing our plain chant. It's really a transcendent moment for us culturally. So let me talk a little bit about why. I talked, whoops, helps if I'm actually in the PowerPoint. Yes, come back up. All right, I will do this because I can't see it. Whoops, there we go. Pressures on church music. So we had all those foundations, and they were doing a lot of prayer. We also have, during this period, a number of benefices. So a benefice is like an endowed position for a musician, or for a priest, or for someone who is involved in doing the liturgy. And you got them from the Pope. We talked about the papal schism. What happens is you start getting sort of the doubling up during that latter 14th century, some people are getting benefice promises out of one pope. Other people are getting benefice promises out of the other pope. So you sort of have a professionalization of the musical choirs of Europe during that period of the papal schism. It wasn't an intended consequence, but we'll take accident because it leads to occagum, right? And benefices get larger and wealthier, and you start doing the done thing, which is, gee, I don't have time to do that ceremony. I'll pay these pennies over to that other person who I know can sing pretty well. They can swap in for me, and I'm going to go back over to this place over here. They'll sing at one church, I'll sing at the other church, and all of a sudden, town has 3 or 4 competing places, all of which have professional singers or quasi-professional singers. Their main jobs are as clerics, which is clerks. In other words, it's like the AAs of a university all got together, and every Sunday we're doing church ceremonies. It's kind of a weird thing because their day jobs are really doing things like filling out forms and handling tax payments and making sure that everybody's doing what they need to be doing, but then they do this lovely music. The patrons are competing with one another, and if the French court can do it, so can the Italian courts. And so this is the 15th century, the rise of the Medici, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and all of the French imported musicians who the Medici bring down to Italy in order to sing well. It's the period of Isabella d'Este, who invents fashion sort of out of her brain. She makes fancy dresses that get written about all over Europe, and she has people write her great music so that she can sing as part of the kind of court entertainments. And she pays for it. She's like a little extravagant. Daddy never said no. So she winds up with a courtly entourage of like 60 musicians, some of whom are instrumentalists, some of whom are professional singers, and her dwarf, who sings a really mean tenor. So she, her dwarf, and the other singer would go riding in the carriage and sing songs together. So I love Isabella d'Este. She was weird, but my kind of weird. So that ability to then bring this fancy ceremony to light is one of the things you're doing, and all of those obits that we've been talking about. So I said at the beginning, the Black Death releases some population pressure. You've already cleared your fields, and with a third fewer humans needing to eat from those fields, quality of life does go up in the latter part of the 14th century. It's an unfortunate reason why, but it does mean that there is disposable income. That is not unrelated to all of these benefices and all of the endowments that we've been talking about this hour. And so the ability to put money into the economy to support the arts is something that actually has an impact on the way in which music unfolds. You have more commissions, you have more benefices, less competition, and you have the emergence of these named singers who compose. So a lot of the 13th century music is anonymous. I mean, we have a few names, but it's mostly like stuff, right? There's chant. Just lives in those magical musical manuscripts. But in the 14th century, you get these named singers, these inheritors of the tradition of the troubadours. And one of them is Machaut. Yeah, gotta do this. And this leads me into my deploration. Laments for the death of famous musicians are kind of one of the cultural quirks of this late Middle Ages. You've got a number of them, and they tend to focus on those people who are in our music history textbooks. So you have Machaut, who dies in 1377, lived into his 70s, so a very venerable man when he dies. He styled himself as a follow-along to the troubadours. He considered himself a rhetorician, although we think of him as a composer. His responsibilities at court included packing the baggage as the court picked up and moved from one place to another. And he left this legacy of beautiful music, and people loved it. Well, when he died, armée amour, weapons, loves, lady chivalry, clerks, musicians, and writers in French, everyone, all of these people, let's gather together and sort of lament his passing. And the text for this is on your handout. So all of us together, all of those of us who are cultured, should lament the death of this noble rhetorician. So this is the only example of music we have by Francois Andrieux. Sorry, had a moment. But the next, as we move into the 15th century, this process of lamenting for your famous musician becomes like a chain of who's who. So you actually remember our friend Ockeghem, the one who wrote that Polyphonic Mass. Well, here is his déploration on the death of Belchois. So who's Belchois? Belchois is this cultured court poet at the Kings of France court who's writing secular songs. And so his death is killing joyousness. So low texture, dark, moving songs. So there's one for Ockeghem on Belchois. There's then one by Josquin. And here is your other text on the handout, Nymphe de Bois, at the bottom of page 1. Nymphe de Bois, nymphs of the forest. This is the kind of canonical lament because it is Josquin de Près, that hero of the 16th century, writing a lament on the death of Ockeghem. So one more little clip. Later in the song, when you get up to the part that's in bold, we are instructed to put on the clothes of mourning. And then, if you think back to our list of requiems, who is to put on the clothes of mourning? So those people who are to put on their mourning clothes, that clothes of sadness, are those people in that French orbit who are out writing those Requiem Masses in this very next generation. Josquin, together with Pierre de la Rue, Brumel, Compère, they're all in this tradition of lamenting together, lamenting for the death of Ockeghem, whose Requiem was so transformative at that end of the 15th century. So next time, we'll be moving back into a little bit more upbeat wedding material. We'll talk a bit about motets. I threw motets aside today, saying in passing they can be for personal reasons. Next time, we will see that personal reasons include the gathering together, husband and wife, as they choose to take wedding vows together in public, in ceremonial, that we'll talk about next week. Thank you so much. The links to